What if the beginning you were taught was not truly the beginning at all? What if the first crowned pharaoh was not the first to rule, but only the first to be named? You settle into this question gently, the way one eases into warm water rather than stepping sharply. The Nile has not yet been lined with temples in your mind. The crowns have not yet taken shape. Instead, there is quiet land, dark soil, and people who live without writing their names into stone. Most historians agree that Egypt, as a unified kingdom, formed gradually over thousands of years, not in a single dramatic moment. But one interpretation is that stories written much later may preserve echoes of how people imagined the time before rulers had faces. And what if those echoes feel strange, because they were never meant to be literal, only remembered? Before you go any further, let the day loosen its grip. If you are listening at night, notice the weight of your body, where it rests. If it is morning where you are, imagine this story as a slow beginning rather than an awakening. So before you begin this journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. These small details quietly connect listeners across places and hours. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You imagine Egypt before Egypt. The river still floods. The reeds still whisper. Villages rise and fall with seasons rather than dynasties. Archaeology suggests that long before Pharaoh's people along the Nile farmed, traded, and buried their dead with care. Graves from this era contain pottery tools and personal items. What's broadly accepted is that these communities were organized, but not yet centralized, under divine kingship. One interpretation is that authority existed without spectacle, guided more by tradition than by command. And what if leadership once felt less like rule and more like presence? Later texts speak of a time before human kings, a distant age ruled by beings who watched rather than governed. These figures are often called watchers. In modern retellings, though the ancient words vary, the evidence we do have points to mythological language rather than historical record. Still, a careful reading might suggest that these stories were not meant to describe rulers with thrones, but principles that shaped the world. And what if watching was a way of describing order itself, quiet and constant? You move slowly through this imagined landscape. There are no monuments yet, only markers made of wood and memory. Most historians agree that writing appears in Egypt around 3200 BCE, meaning everything. Before that survives through archaeology and much later storytelling. Historians still argue whether myths about pre-dynastic times preserve real social memories, or whether they are symbolic inventions created to explain how kingship later emerged. The mystery is not in the lack of answers, but in how carefully ancient people framed their questions. One interpretation is that watchers represented cosmic balance rather than beings. In many early cultures, the idea that the world was observed mattered more than who did the observing. A more cautious explanation could be that humans personified natural forces to make sense of unpredictability. Floods came, droughts followed, life depended on patterns that no individual controlled. And what if imagining watchers made uncertainty feel manageable? There is a popular rumor that ancient Egyptians believed gods once ruled physically on Earth before humans took over. This theory is not widely accepted, but it appears often in later religious and philosophical texts. Archaeology suggests no physical evidence for non-human rulers, and the evidence is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less about hidden history and more about how people understood time. What if the idea of earlier rulers was a way of saying that the world once felt closer to the sacred? You notice how later Egyptian religion places enormous emphasis on Ma'at, the concept of order, balance, and truth. What's broadly accepted is that Ma'at structured everything from law to agriculture. One interpretation is that before kings enforced Ma'at, it was believed to exist on its own. And what if the Watchers were simply the imagination giving a face to balance before institutions claimed it? The tone of these early myths is rarely violent. There are no great wars at the beginning. Instead, there is observation arrangement and watching. This matters. It suggests a worldview where creation was stable before it was political. Scholars continue to debate how much of this imagery reflects nostalgia for a simpler past. A careful reading might suggest that people looked backward not to recover facts, but to recover calm. You pause here, letting the idea settle. There is something comforting about a time watched over rather than ruled. Most historians agree that early societies often imagined origins as peaceful and ordered. One interpretation is that these stories helped people endure the chaos of later periods. And what if telling stories about watchers was less about power and more about reassurance? As the river flows quietly beside you, you realize something important. Some parts of this story are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. The mystery is not whether watchers existed as beings, but why the idea of being watched felt necessary. The evidence we do have points to human imagination working carefully alongside survival. You let that thought drift with you as the night deepens. The land remains patient and wide. The river continues its slow work. And somewhere in the space between history and story, the idea of watchers lingers, not demanding belief, only attention. You remain in this earlier world, where the idea of kingship has not yet settled into bone and stone. The land stretches without borders, defined more by water and season than by decree. What's broadly accepted is that during the Neolithic and pre-dynastic periods, communities along the Nile organized themselves through kinship, shared labor, and ritual, rather than centralized authority. Archaeology suggests that villages clustered near fertile ground, adjusting their lives to the rhythm of flooding, rather than the commands of a ruler. One interpretation is that power existed, but it was situational and temporary. And what if authority felt less like something imposed, and more like something that rose when needed, then gently receded? You picture daily life unfolding without crowns or titles. Decisions are made close to the ground. When to plant, when to move, when to wait. The evidence we do have points to cooperation as a survival strategy. Granaries appear before palaces. Burial customs emerge before royal tombs. Most historians agree that social hierarchy existed, but it was shallow compared to later dynasties. A careful reading might suggest that respect was earned through experience, rather than inherited through blood. And what if this way of living shaped later myths about a time before kings? In this landscape, stories matter. Without writing, memory carries weight. Elders speak, rituals repeat. What's broadly accepted is that oral tradition played a central role in transmitting values and explanations. One interpretation is that figures later described as watchers began as narrative anchors, ways to explain why certain rules were followed even when no one was enforcing them. And what if watching was a metaphor for collective memory, the feeling that actions were noticed because they mattered to the group? As you walk along the imagined riverbank, you notice how open everything feels. There are no walls yet, no monumental gates. Archaeology suggests that defensive structures become common only later, when competition intensifies. A more cautious explanation could be that early abundance reduced conflict. And what if peace was remembered not because it was perfect, but because it felt unguarded? Later Egyptian texts describe a primeval age of harmony before disorder entered the world. The evidence we do have points to myth rather than chronology. Historians still argue whether these descriptions reflect actual social conditions or whether they are idealized contrasts created to explain why order must be actively maintained. One interpretation is that when life became more complex, people looked back and imagined simplicity as a lost inheritance. There is a fringe idea that early societies were guided by beings who did not rule openly, but observed and corrected from a distance. This theory is not widely accepted, and it lacks physical evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about guidance rather than control. What if the Watchers represented the feeling that the world itself had expectations long before laws were written? You consider how later kings would claim divine sanction, presenting themselves as intermediaries between gods and people. Archaeology suggests this ideology developed gradually. One interpretation is that as societies grew larger, invisible moral pressure was no longer enough. And what if the rise of kings marked the moment when watching turned into ruling? There are small clues in the ground. Amulets shaped like animals, burials aligned with care. What's broadly accepted is that symbolism existed early even without grand theology. A careful reading might suggest that people already believed in forces beyond the visible. And what if the Watchers were never separate beings at all, but names given to that quiet sense of alignment between action and consequence? You slow your steps, letting the silence do some of the work. The land feels wide enough to breathe. Most historians agree that early Nile communities were resilient and adaptive. One interpretation is that flexibility was their strength. And what if stories about unseen watchers helped maintain that flexibility, reminding people that balance mattered more than dominance? Later myths often describe chaos entering the world, requiring gods or kings to restore order. The evidence we do have points to this as a narrative pattern rather than a record of catastrophe. Scholars continue to debate whether such stories reflect real environmental stress or philosophical reflection. A more cautious explanation could be that complexity itself felt like disorder. And what if the memory of a watcher-guided world was simply the memory of fewer choices? You notice how calm this imagined past feels. Not perfect, but steady. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And yet the idea lingers that before thrones and crowns, people felt accompanied rather than governed. As the river continues its slow curve, you sense how easily watching can turn into remembering. The land does not need a ruler to exist. It only needs time. And in that time, stories settle like silt, shaping what comes next without ever fully hardening into fact. You begin to notice how the idea of watching changes when it moves from daily life into story. In quiet communities, being watched can feel reassuring rather than threatening. What's broadly accepted is that many early societies imagined the world as attentive, responsive to human behavior. Archaeology suggests that symbols of eyes, animals, and guardians appear long before complex pantheons form. One interpretation is that these images reflect a moral landscape rather than a populated one. And what if watchers were never rulers at all, but reminders that actions echoed beyond the moment? You picture small rituals carried out at dawn or dusk. Offerings left not to please a king, but to maintain balance. The evidence we do have points to ritual behavior embedded in everyday tasks. Grinding grain, sharing water, burying the dead with care. Most historians agree that religion in early Egypt was practical before it was grand. A careful reading might suggest that belief functioned as a stabilizing habit rather than a doctrine. And what if the watchers symbolize that habit steady and impersonal? As you move deeper into this idea, the watchers feel less like figures and more like a concept. Watching does not require intervention. It requires continuity. Archaeology suggests that continuity mattered deeply to Nile communities because survival depended on predictability. Floods had to come, but not too much. Seasons had to turn, but not too sharply. One interpretation is that imagining watchers helped explain why balance sometimes failed. And what if stories about watching were ways to cope when order slipped? Later Egyptian mythology introduces gods who actively intervene, argue, and sometimes fail. But what's broadly accepted is that these stories were written down much later during periods of established kingship. Historians still argue whether earlier, quieter beliefs were overwritten by more dramatic theology as political power grew. A more cautious explanation could be that stories became louder because societies did. And what if the watchers belonged to a softer layer of belief that never needed spectacle? You consider how often ancient texts describe the past as purer, not stronger, not wiser, just calmer. The evidence we do have points to nostalgia as a recurring human theme. One interpretation is that when systems become complex, people imagine origins as simple. And what if watchers represented that imagined simplicity, a time when order did not need enforcement? There is a popular rumor that watchers were once teachers, guiding humanity in secret. This theory is not widely accepted and lacks archaeological support. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a metaphor for learning itself. What if early people felt taught by the land, the river, and repetition, and later stories turned that feeling into figures? You pause to notice how language works here. Watching implies awareness without interference. Ruling implies control. Archaeology suggests that control intensified as populations grew. One interpretation is that watchers fade from stories as rulers rise because authority becomes visible. And what if invisible order was replaced not because it failed, but because it was no longer enough? In early graves, there are no crowns. There are beads, tools, and food. What's broadly accepted is that social identity mattered, but not royal identity. A careful reading might suggest that people define themselves by role rather than rank. And what if the Watchers reflected a worldview where the community itself was the observer? You let this idea rest for a moment. Being watched by your own group is different from being ruled by one person. The evidence we do have points to shared responsibility as a key feature of early societies. Scholars continue to debate how long this balance lasted before hierarchy hardened. A more cautious explanation could be that hierarchy crept in slowly, almost unnoticed. And what if the Watchers disappeared, not in a moment, but in a gradual forgetting? Later myths sometimes describe Watchers withdrawing rather than being overthrown. This detail matters. It suggests absence, not defeat. What's broadly accepted is that ancient storytellers often explained change through departure rather than destruction. One interpretation is that when people began to rule themselves, the idea of being watched gently stepped back. And what if that retreat felt like loss? You notice how this story never quite settles. That feels intentional. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in proving whether Watchers existed, but in understanding why watching mattered so much. As the imagined light softens around the river, the idea of Watchers grows quieter. Not gone, just less defined. The land continues to hold memory without needing witnesses. And you begin to sense that the most enduring watcher may have always been time itself, steady, patient, and impossible to see. You start to sense how these quiet ideas did not belong to Egypt alone. Long before borders hardened, stories traveled easily. What's broadly accepted is that early civilizations across the Near East shared motifs through trade, migration, and conversation. Archaeology suggests that object styles and symbols moved along river systems and land routes long before writing fixed them in place. One interpretation is that myths moved the same way, adapting as they went. And what if the idea of watchers was not owned by any one culture, but borrowed, reshaped, and softened wherever it settled? As you drift outward from the Nile in your imagination, you notice similar figures appearing elsewhere. In Mesopotamia, in the Levant, in early Anatolia, stories speak of beings who observe, record, or maintain order. The evidence we do have points to shared human concerns rather than shared events. Most historians agree that similar environments tend to produce similar myths. A careful reading might suggest that watchers emerge wherever people feel dependent on forces they cannot control. And what if watching was simply the most natural way to describe those forces? These early societies lived close to uncertainty. Floods could nourish or destroy. Crops could thrive or fail. What's broadly accepted is that survival required cooperation and careful timing. One interpretation is that stories of watchers offered reassurance that someone or something noticed effort, patience, and restraint. And what if the comfort came not from protection, but from the idea that the world was not indifferent? Later texts often exaggerate these beings, giving them name hierarchies and conflicts. Archaeology suggests that these developments appear alongside growing political complexity. Historians still argue whether mythology becomes more elaborate because beliefs deepen, or because societies need stronger narratives to support authority. A more cautious explanation could be that storytelling simply grows more detailed over time. And what if the watchers grew louder in story precisely because they were fading from daily experience? You notice an important shift here. In earlier imagined times, watchers do not demand worship. They do not issue commands. They watch. That distinction matters. What's broadly accepted is that early moral systems often relied on shame, honor, and memory, rather than punishment. One interpretation is that being observed by the community was enough to guide behavior. And what if the watchers were extensions of that social gaze made cosmic? In some traditions, watchers are said to withdraw when humans begin to govern themselves poorly. This theory is not widely accepted as history. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reads like a lesson rather than a record. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if it is saying that when responsibility shifts, guidance must shift too? As these ideas spread and transform, they pick up local colors. In Egypt, balance and continuity dominate. In Mesopotamia, order struggles against chaos. The evidence we do have points to different emphases shaped by environment. A careful reading might suggest that watchers take on the values each culture fears losing. And what if the watchers are mirrors rather than masters? You pause on the idea of mirroring. Watching reflects back what is seen. What's broadly accepted is that myth often reflects social values more clearly than daily life does. One interpretation is that people place their highest hopes into the past, imagining earlier ages as morally clearer. And what if the watchers belong to that imagined clarity, a way of saying that once things made sense? There is a popular rumor that watchers were once physical beings who traveled between cultures. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is no archaeological evidence to support it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about connection. What if the real travelers were ideas carried by people who never thought of themselves as storytellers? You return in your mind to the Nile, carrying these broader patterns with you. Egypt did not develop in isolation. What's broadly accepted is that early Egypt interacted with neighboring regions through trade and shared practices. One interpretation is that ideas about watching and order were part of that exchange. And what if Egypt's later focus on eternal balance drew strength from a much older shared human impulse? As societies grew, stories changed function. Watching turned into judging. Guardians turned into gods. The evidence we do have points to increasing specialization in religion and governance. Scholars continue to debate whether this shift was driven more by belief or by politics. A more cautious explanation could be that the two were never separate. And what if watchers faded because belief itself became organized? You let the idea soften rather than harden. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in tracing watchers across maps, but in noticing how easily the idea takes root wherever humans feel small under large skies. As the night settles deeper, the watchers feel less like figures and more like a shared human gesture. The act of looking outward and sensing meaning looking back. Cultures differ. rivers change. But the feeling repeats, and in that repetition you sense not a secret history, but a quiet continuity that never needed to rule in order to endure. You drift now toward texts that speak softly of beginnings written long after the time they describe. Stone walls rise in your imagination at Edfu, covered with inscriptions carved during the Ptolemaic period. What's broadly accepted is that these texts were composed thousands of years after the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization. Archaeology suggests they reflect religious ideas current at the time of writing, not eyewitness accounts of deep prehistory. One interpretation is that the Edfu texts preserve layered memories, older concepts folded into later theology. And what if they are less a record of events and more a record of how Egyptians thought about origins? The Edfu inscriptions describe a primordial time when divine beings shaped the land before human kings appeared. The language is symbolic, filled with metaphors of struggle, order, and emergence. The evidence we do have points to mythic storytelling rather than historical chronicle. Still, a careful reading might suggest that these stories served a purpose beyond entertainment. And what if they were designed to place human kingship within a much longer, more reassuring cosmic timeline? You notice how the text speaks of a world that needed preparation before it could be ruled. Land had to be stabilized. Chaos had to be named. Boundaries had to be imagined before they could be enforced. Most historians agree that such narratives helped legitimize later political structures by presenting them as the natural outcome of a long process. One interpretation is that describing rulers before rulers made kingship feel inevitable rather than invented. And what if the Watchers appear here as placeholders for a time when order existed without administration? The figures in these texts are not exactly watchers, as later traditions imagine them, but they share familiar qualities. They observe, they shape, they withdraw once their task is complete. Archaeology suggests no evidence that Egyptians believed these beings walked among ordinary people in historical time. Historians still argue whether these primordial figures represent memories of earlier social systems or purely symbolic expressions of cosmic balance. The uncertainty matters because it keeps the story open rather than closed. You let the imagery settle slowly, islands rising from water, boundaries forming, silence giving way to structure. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptian cosmology often begins with water and emergence. One interpretation is that these stories reflect lived experience with the Nile flood. And what if imagining watchers helped people conceptualize how order could arise repeatedly from apparent chaos? There is a fringe idea that the Edfu texts encode knowledge of a lost advanced civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it lacks support from material evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less about hidden technology and more about storytelling ambition. What if later priests wanted their myths to feel ancient, authoritative, and deeper than memory? You notice how carefully the texts distinguish us between divine time and human time. Events unfold in a realm that does not quite touch everyday life. The evidence we do have points to intentional separation rather than confusion. A more cautious explanation could be that Egyptians understood myth as a different category of truth. And what if watchers belong entirely to that category, meaningful without needing to be factual? These stories also explain why humans must maintain order. The divine age establishes principles. Humans inherit responsibility. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptian religion emphasized continuity and duty. One interpretation is that the Watchers set the pattern, not the rules. And what if the message was never about who ruled first, but about why ruling must be careful? You sense how comforting that would be. If order existed before humans, then humans are not alone in maintaining it. The evidence we do have points to religion as a stabilizing force during periods of uncertainty. Scholars continue to debate whether these myths emerged in response to political stress or theological reflection. A more cautious explanation could be that they served both roles at once. The Edfu texts do not demand belief in literal watchers. They invite contemplation. They slow the listener down. They create a sense of depth. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in extracting a hidden history, but in understanding why these stories were preserved with such care. As you step back from the carved walls in your mind, you notice something subtle. These texts are not anxious. They do not warn of disaster. They do not insist on secrets. They describe a world that settled into order over time. And what if that calm tone is the most important clue of all? You carry that calm with you as the imagined temple fades. The Watchers here do not loom, they recede. They finish their work and leave space behind. And in that space, human history begins not abruptly, but as a continuation. The land remains, the river flows, and the story moves forward, patient, unhurried, and still listening. You remain with the sense that order existed before anyone claimed ownership of it. The story shifts gently now, not forward in time, but inward toward how people understood structure itself. Archaeology suggests that ritual spaces in early Egypt appeared before formal government buildings. What's broadly accepted is that ceremony often precedes administration. One interpretation is that people practiced order long before they enforced it. And what if the Watchers represent that earlier phase, when balance was felt rather than commanded? You imagine gatherings near the river at predictable times of year. The flood recedes. Silt darkens the ground. Seeds are placed carefully, almost ceremonially. The evidence we do have points to agriculture as both a practical and symbolic act. Most historians agree that farming along the Nile required cooperation and timing. A careful reading might suggest that successful harvests felt less like achievements and more like confirmations that the world was still aligned. And what if watching was the language used to describe that alignment? Later, Egyptian thought places enormous importance on correct action. Not dramatic action, just correct. Weighing, measuring, repeating what works. What's broadly accepted is that this mindset shaped Egyptian culture for millennia. One interpretation is that before kings enforced Ma'at, people enforced it themselves through shared expectations. And what if the Watchers were imagined as the quiet witnesses to those expectations present but not intervening? You notice how different this feels from later divine stories filled with conflict, and rivalry. Here, nothing battles for dominance. Order emerges slowly, almost reluctantly. The evidence we do have points to stability as a valued ideal. Historians still argue whether this emphasis reflects real early conditions or later nostalgia projected backward. A more cautious explanation could be that calm stories survive because they comforted listeners in turbulent times. There is a popular rumor that early Egyptians believed order would collapse. Without constant divine oversight, this idea is not widely accepted in this form. Archaeology suggests instead that people believed order could be maintained through correct behavior. If we treat the rumor as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about responsibility. What if the Watchers did not hold the world together, but reminded people that it could fall apart if neglected? You move through an imagined settlement at dusk. Fires are lit. Tools are set aside. The day closes without ceremony. The evidence we do have points to routine, as sacred in its own way. Most historians agree that repetition builds culture. One interpretation is that rituals emerged from habit rather than revelation. And what if the Watchers are simply habit given a face in story? As societies grew, habit alone may have felt insufficient. Larger populations needed clearer roles. Archaeology suggests increasing social differentiation toward the end of the pre-dynastic period. A careful reading might suggest that once people no longer knew everyone personally, the sense of being watched by the community weakened. And what if invisible watchers filled that gap, extending moral presence beyond direct social ties? This is where the idea becomes delicate. Watching can comfort, but it can also constrain. What's broadly accepted is that moral systems evolve alongside social complexity. One interpretation is that watchers became less gentle as societies demanded stronger enforcement. Historians still argue whether this shift reflects genuine belief change or political necessity. A more cautious explanation could be that stories adapted to keep order working. You notice how later gods take on judgment, reward, and punishment. Earlier, watchers do not. The evidence we do have points to a transformation in how accountability was imagined. And what if this transformation marks the true beginning of kingship, not when crowns appeared, but when watching turned into judging? You pause here, letting the idea settle into something softer. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery is not in identifying who watched first, but in understanding why watching felt necessary before ruling ever did. The river beside you continues its patient rhythm. It does not judge. It does not command. It rises and falls. And in its steady movement, you sense why early people might have believed the world already knew how to behave, long before anyone claimed the authority to tell it how. You lift your attention upward now, not away from the land, but above it. The sky has always been part of this story. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Egyptians observed the heavens with care long before formal astronomy was recorded. Archaeology suggests that even early communities aligned burials and ritual spaces with celestial events. One interpretation is that watching the sky helped people anticipate seasonal change. And what if looking upward also carried the quiet feeling of being seen in return? Night arrives gently in your imagination. The river darkens. The stars sharpen. The evidence we do have points to repeated observation rather than sudden discovery. Most historians agree that early star knowledge grew from patience. Patterns were noticed because they returned. A careful reading might suggest that the sky offered reassurance through reliability. And what if watchers were first imagined not on the ground, but overhead, steady and distant? Later Egyptian texts speak of imperishable stars, lights that never set. What's broadly accepted is that these stars were associated with eternity and continuity. One interpretation is symbolic, linking unchanging lights to unending order. And what if the idea of watchers emerged from this experience of constancy, the sense that something above never blinked or looked away? You consider how different this feels from later religious imagery filled with action and conflict. The stars do not intervene. They remain. Archaeology suggests that early cosmology emphasized cycles rather than events. Historians still argue whether this emphasis reflects early lived experience or later theological editing. A more cautious explanation could be that cyclical environments encourage cyclical thinking. And what if the watchers are simply the human response to rhythms too large to touch? There is a popular rumor that ancient Egyptians believed specific beings lived among the stars watching humanity. This theory is not widely accepted as literal belief. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reads like poetic language. What if saying the stars watched was a way of expressing awe without explanation? You notice how often watching appears in connection with timekeeping, counting days, marking seasons, predicting floods. The evidence we do have points to astronomy as a practical tool first. One interpretation is that usefulness came before symbolism. And what if meaning followed function, turning careful observation into story? In many cultures, the sky becomes a moral map. Actions on Earth are reflected above. What's broadly accepted is that this idea appears across civilizations. A careful reading might suggest that people projected social values onto the heavens because the sky felt impartial. And what if watchers gained their authority from distance, not power? You imagine standing still beneath that vastness. No walls, no ceilings, just openness. The evidence we do have points to early humans experiencing night skies without artificial light. Most historians agree that this would have been overwhelming in a quiet way. One interpretation is that such an experience encourages humility. And what if watchers were born from humility rather than fear? As societies grew, the sky was gradually claimed by god stories and eventually calendars, controlled by institutions. Archaeology suggests increasing specialization in astronomical roles. Historians still argue whether this professionalization changed belief or simply formalized it. A more cautious explanation could be that expertise replaced shared observation. And what if watchers faded as the sky became measured instead of wondered at? Later royal ideology links kings with stars, placing rulers among the eternal lights after death. What's broadly accepted is that this reinforced authority by tying it to permanence. One interpretation is that kings inherited the watching role once held by the sky itself. And what if the transition from watchers to rulers happened first in imagination, then in politics? You pause with that thought, letting it settle, without urgency. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in deciding who watched from above, but in understanding why the sky felt trustworthy enough to imagine watching at all. The stars continue their slow turning. They do not speak. They do not instruct. They simply remain. And in that steady presence, you sense how easily watching becomes a metaphor for endurance. The watchers here are not beings with names. They are the night itself, constant, patient, and unhurried. As your gaze lowers again toward the river and the land, the sky does not disappear. It stays holding its place. And the idea of watchers stays with it, not as rulers, not as judges, but as the quiet suggestion that order might exist, even when no one is in charge. You return gently to the ground, carrying the sky with you as a quiet backdrop. The idea of watchers begins to take on another shape. Not cosmic this time, but moral. What's broadly accepted is that early societies used stories to teach behavior long before formal law codes appeared. Archaeology suggests that shared values were reinforced through ritual repetition and narrative, rather than punishment. One interpretation is that watchers functioned as moral reminders rather than enforcers. And what if being watched mattered most when no one else was around? You imagine a child learning how to act by listening rather than being told. Stories of consequences. Stories of balance. The evidence we do have points to oral tradition as a powerful tool for shaping conduct. Most historians agree that morality in early cultures was taught through example and story. A careful reading might suggest that watchers embodied the idea that actions echo beyond immediate reward or consequence. And what if the watchers were simply the voice of memory, reminding people of what happens when balance slips? Later Egyptian religion includes judgment scenes, scales, and formal evaluation of the soul. What's broadly accepted is that these concepts developed over time. One interpretation is that earlier moral systems were less structured, relying on internalized values. Historians still argue whether moral judgment in Egypt began as an external process or an internal one. A more cautious explanation could be that both existed, but in different proportions. And what if watchers represent that earlier internal sense of being accountable? There is a popular rumor that watchers punished humanity for moral failure. This theory isn't widely accepted and appears mostly in later reinterpretations. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a warning story rather than a belief. What if the threat of punishment was less important than the reminder of responsibility? You notice how often myths describe watchers as silent. Silence matters. The evidence we do have points to silence as a teaching tool. Not every lesson needs explanation. Most historians agree that early ritual relied heavily on repetition rather than instruction. One interpretation is that watchers did not speak because their role was to observe, not to argue. And what if that silence encouraged self-reflection? In small communities, reputation carries weight. What's broadly accepted is that social memory regulates behavior effectively. Archaeology suggests that ostracism and shame were powerful motivators. A careful reading might suggest that watchers extend this social gaze beyond the village. And what if imagining unseen observers helped maintain order when community bonds stretched thin? As societies expanded, moral systems had to scale. Stories grew more detailed. Consequences became clearer. Historians still argue whether increasing moral complexity drove myth development or followed it. A more cautious explanation could be that growth demanded clarity. And what if watchers gradually transformed into judges because watching alone no longer felt sufficient? You pause to feel how gentle this shift is in story. There is no rebellion, no overthrow. Watching simply becomes something else. The evidence we do have points to gradual evolution rather than rupture. One interpretation is that people did not abandon earlier ideas, they reinterpreted them. And what if watchers never disappeared, but were absorbed into later concepts of conscience and law? You sense how this idea could comfort listeners long after its origin. Being watched can feel heavy, but it can also feel like belonging. What's broadly accepted is that humans seek meaning in accountability. A careful reading might suggest that watchers provided that meaning without requiring hierarchy. And what if this is why the idea persisted even as political systems changed? Some parts of this story are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in whether watchers punished or rewarded, but in why people felt the need to imagine observation as a force at all. As the imagined evening deepens, you feel how morality softens when framed as care rather than control. The watchers here are not threatening. They are reminders. They do not stand above you. They stand within the story, quiet, patient, and attentive, asking nothing more than awareness. You begin to sense how these ideas echo beyond Egypt again, folding into neighboring stories that feel both familiar and altered. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian civilizations developed their own rich mythologies alongside Egypt, sometimes earlier, sometimes in parallel. Archaeology suggests sustained contact through trade routes, shared materials, and migrating people. One interpretation is that ideas about watching, recording, and oversight traveled as easily as goods. And what if the watchers you are following are less a single tradition and more a shared human shorthand? In Mesopotamian texts, beings appear who observe humanity, record actions, and report upward to higher gods. The evidence we do have points to a developed bureaucratic imagination even in myth. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies place strong emphasis on law contracts and written record. A careful reading might suggest that their watcher-like figures reflect administrative culture projected onto the cosmos. And what if watching became more formal, where society itself became more formal? This contrast is revealing. In Egypt, watching feels cyclical and quiet. In Mesopotamia, watching feels procedural. What's broadly accepted is that environment-shaped worldview. Unpredictable rivers encouraged different myths than predictable ones. Historians still argue whether myth drives social structure or whether social structure reshapes myth. A more cautious explanation could be that the relationship runs both ways slowly and unevenly. You notice how watchers in Mesopotamian stories sometimes fail. They miss things. They report inaccurately. The evidence we do have points to mythology that accepts error even in divine systems. One interpretation is that this reflects lived experience with imperfect governance. And what if telling stories about flawed watchers made human flaws easier to live with? There is a popular rumor that Mesopotamian watchers and Egyptian primordial beings describe the same historical entities. This theory isn't widely accepted and lacks supporting evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about human pattern making. What if similarities arise not from shared beings, but from shared needs? You consider how writing changes everything. Once actions can be recorded, watching becomes permanent. Archaeology suggests that the rise of writing transformed memory and accountability. Most historians agree that written records allow societies to grow beyond face-to-face trust. A careful reading might suggest that mythic watchers grew more prominent once watching could outlast the watcher. And what if the idea of being observed forever emerged alongside the idea of writing things down? In Mesopotamian law codes, divine authority legitimizes human rules. Watching moves from passive observation to active judgment. What's broadly accepted is that this strengthened centralized power. One interpretation is that invisible oversight made obedience feel cosmic rather than political. And what if the watchers here were less about belief and more about compliance? You return again to Egypt with this contrast in mind. Egyptian watcher-like concepts rarely emphasize record-keeping. They emphasize balance. The evidence we do have points to different moral priorities. Scholars continue to debate whether Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythologies influenced each other directly or developed independently from similar pressures. A more cautious explanation could be that both processes occurred at once. You sense how easy it is for modern listeners to collapse these stories into one narrative. But ancient people likely experienced them as local, grounded, and specific. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in unifying watchers across cultures, but in understanding why so many cultures imagined being observed. As the night continues, the idea of watchers feels heavier here, more structured. Not threatening, but official. And that difference matters. It reminds you that watching can mean many things depending on who is doing it and why. You let that weight settle briefly, then soften again. Stories do not replace each other cleanly. They overlap. They fade. They leave impressions. And as you drift forward, you carry both versions with you. The gentle watcher of balance and the careful watcher of record, each reflecting a different answer to the same quiet human question. You arrive now at the point where the story becomes more delicate, where curiosity brushes up against caution. The idea of rulers before humans appears most clearly. Here not in archaeology, but in speculation. What's broadly accepted is that there is no material evidence for non-human civilizations ruling Egypt before recorded history. Archaeology suggests continuous human development rather than sudden replacement. One interpretation is that stories of pre-human rulers emerge when gaps in knowledge feel uncomfortable. And what if mystery itself invites invention? Across time, people have wondered whether something came before them that was greater, wiser, or more ordered. The evidence we do have points to this pattern appearing repeatedly in many cultures. Most historians agree that imagining a lost golden age is a common response to uncertainty. A careful reading might suggest that these stories say more about the present than the past. And what if watchers who ruled before Egypt reflect anxiety about how fragile human systems feel? There is a fringe idea that advanced beings governed early humanity and left traces only in myth. This theory isn't widely accepted and lacks archaeological support. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a modern myth layered onto ancient ones. What if contemporary fascination with watches says more about modern longing for guidance than ancient belief? You notice how often these theories rely on absence. No buildings, no tools, no remains, just stories. What's broadly accepted is that absence of evidence is not evidence of hidden mastery. Archaeology suggests that even highly advanced societies leave traces. Historians still argue whether myth can preserve factual memory across thousands of years without material support. A more cautious explanation could be that myth preserves meaning, not events. You slow your pace here because it matters how the story is told. We are not proving anything. Tonight, we are following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And when the evidence is thin, we say so. You think again about why watchers are described as rulers in some retellings. Ruling implies hierarchy, intention, and command. But earlier watchers in this story rarely command. They observe. The evidence we do have points to a shift in language over time. One interpretation is that later cultures projected their own political realities backward. And what if watchers were retrofitted into rulers once ruling became central to human life? There is also a quieter explanation. People may have needed to believe that order existed before chaos, that wisdom predated confusion. What's broadly accepted is that origin stories often comfort more than they inform. A careful reading might suggest that imagining ancient rulers provided reassurance that humanity did not invent order from nothing. And what if this reassurance mattered more than accuracy? You consider how modern storytelling often sharpens mystery into certainty. Ancient stories were softer. They allowed space. Historians still argue whether ancient audiences took myths literally or symbolically. A more cautious explanation could be that the distinction mattered less to them. And what if watchers ruled only in the sense that gravity rules quietly without intention? As you let this settle, the idea of pre-human rulers begins to loosen its grip. It becomes less about hidden history and more about emotional truth. The evidence we do have points to continuity rather than replacement. Humans did not arrive suddenly into an empty world of ruins. They grew adapted and remembered. You rest in that thought. There is no need to fill every silence with answers. Some mysteries exist to slow us down. The watchers here do not demand belief. They invite reflection. And as the night deepens, you sense how easily curiosity can coexist with restraint. You carry that restraint forward. It keeps the story grounded. It keeps the mist separate from the solid ground. And in that balance, the idea of watchers becomes what it may always have been, a question shaped like a story, waiting patiently without ever needing to rule. You ease forward into another layer of the story, where scale begins to stretch and distort. Giants appear here, not suddenly, but gradually growing out of metaphor and memory. What's broadly accepted is that ancient myths across many cultures describe beings of immense size or power. Archaeology suggests no physical evidence for literal giants walking among early Egyptians. One interpretation is that size in myth signals importance rather than height. And what if giants were never meant to be measured in bodies, but in influence? In early storytelling, exaggeration carries meaning. Bigger means older. Taller means closer to the sky. Stronger means harder to forget. The evidence we do have points to symbolic language rather than biological description. Most historians agree that ancient listeners understood this intuitively. A careful reading might suggest that calling watchers giants was a way of expressing how foundational they felt to the world that followed. And what if their size simply marked distance in time? You imagine how memory behaves across generations. Details blur, emotions remain, figures grow larger as their edges soften. What's broadly accepted is that oral traditions tend to magnify beginnings. Historians still argue whether this magnification preserves truth or transforms it. A more cautious explanation could be that it does both at once. And what if giants are the shape memory takes when it stretches too far back to hold clearly? There is a popular rumor that giants represent a lost race, wiped out before recorded history. This theory isn't widely accepted and lacks archaeological support. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about displacement rather than extinction. What if giants symbolize earlier ways of living that felt larger simply because they were unfamiliar to later generations? You notice how Egyptian myth rarely emphasizes physical size in the way some other traditions do. Power is shown through permanence, not mass. The evidence we do have points to stability as the preferred symbol of strength. One interpretation is that when Egyptian stories mention powerful beings before humans, they describe them through function rather than form. And what if watchers were powerful because they established patterns, not because they towered? In later retellings influenced by other cultures, watchers begin to take on more dramatic features. Wings, great stature, glowing presence. What's broadly accepted is that myth absorbs imagery from surrounding traditions over time. Historians still argue whether these additions clarify or obscure original meanings. A more cautious explanation could be that each era reshapes stories to match its own imagination. You pause on the idea of wings. Wings imply movement between realms. The evidence we do have points to wings as symbols of transition, rather than anatomy. A careful reading might suggest that watchers were said to move between states of being, not between locations. And what if wings simply meant that these ideas connected the everyday world to something abstract? Giants also serve another purpose in story. They make humans feel small. What's broadly accepted is that humility plays a role in moral teaching. One interpretation is that imagining beings greater than oneself encourages restraint. And what if giants existed in story to remind humans that they were not the center of everything, especially at the beginning? You notice how gently Egyptian tradition handles this humility. Humans are not punished for existing. They are instructed to maintain balance. The evidence we do have points to cooperation between divine order and human responsibility. Historians still argue whether this reflects optimism or pragmatism. A more cautious explanation could be that it reflects lived experience along a river that demanded respect rather than conquest. Some parts of this story are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in proving giants once walked the land, but in understanding why people needed the past to feel larger than the present. As the idea of giants settles, it softens. They do not loom anymore. They recede into metaphor. What remains is the sense that before humans named themselves rulers, they imagined a world shaped by forces that felt immense, simply because they were not yet understood. You carry that feeling with you as the night continues. Not fear, not awe, just proportion. A reminder that the beginning of any story often feels vast when viewed from the middle. And in that vastness, watchers grow tall, not to dominate, but to mark how far back the memory reaches. You move gently into the landscape itself, now, because belief does not float alone. It settles into places. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Egyptians understood certain locations as sacred long before temples were built there. Archaeology suggests that hills, river bends, springs, and unusual rock formations attracted ritual attention early on. One interpretation is that these places felt watched, not because something lived there, but because they stood out from the ordinary. And what if watchers were first sensed not in the sky or story, but in the land beneath your feet? You imagine walking through a stretch of desert where the ground suddenly changes color, or approaching a bend in the Nile where the current behaves differently. The evidence we do have points to humans everywhere, assigning meaning to such transitions. Most historians agree that sacred landscapes often begin as practical landmarks. A careful reading might suggest that when a place reliably shaped experience, it began to feel intentional. And what if intention was the first step toward imagining observation? In Egypt, later temples are often built atop older sacred sites. What's broadly accepted is that continuity of place mattered deeply. Archaeology suggests that people returned to the same locations for ritual across centuries. One interpretation is that these places held memory. Historians still argue whether sacred sites were chosen because of belief, or whether belief followed repeated use. A more cautious explanation could be that use and belief reinforced each other until separation no longer mattered. You notice how watchers fit easily into this pattern. They do not roam, they do not conquer. They are associated with thresholds, borders between flood and dry land, dawn and dusk, life and death. The evidence we do have points to early ritual focusing on transitions. And what if watchers were imagined as present at moments when certainty thinned? There is a popular rumor that ancient Egyptians believed certain places were guarded by non-human beings. This theory isn't widely accepted in literal terms. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes symbolic. What if guarding meant maintaining balance, not standing watch with intent? You slow near an imagined burial ground. Early graves are simple but careful. Bodies are positioned, objects are placed. What's broadly accepted is that these practices reflect belief in continuity after death. One interpretation is that burial itself is a dialogue with unseen order. And what if watchers were part of that dialogue, representing the sense that death was noticed, not erased? Sacred landscapes also serve social memory. They anchor stories. The evidence we do have points to ritual sites acting as teaching spaces. Elders explain why this place matters. Children learn by returning. Most historians agree that place-based memory is powerful. A careful reading might suggest that watchers are easier to imagine when belief is tied to ground rather than abstraction. As settlements grew sacred, places became formalized. Stones were stacked, walls were raised. Archaeology suggests that architecture crystallizes belief. One interpretation is that once watchers were given homes in story, humans built homes for their stories. And what if temples were not built to house gods, but to preserve attention? You notice how early Egyptian temples emphasize alignment and orientation. Doorways face specific directions. Walls echo natural forms. What's broadly accepted is that these choices reflect cosmological thinking. Historians still argue whether such alignments were symbolic or functional. A more cautious explanation could be that they were both. And what if building in alignment was another way of saying the world was being watched and responded? There is something calming about this idea. Watching does not require motion. It requires presence. Sacred places hold presence without explanation. The evidence we do have points to silence as part of their power. And what if watchers were never meant to be encountered, only felt? You sit with that for a moment. Some parts of this story are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in proving who guarded which place, but in noticing how often humans feel differently in certain spaces. As the imagined night deepens, the land itself feels like a participant. It does not speak, it does not instruct, it simply remains. And in that remaining it watches in its own way, holding memory, shaping movement, and quietly reminding those who pass that not everything important needs a voice. You carry that sense of place forward with you. The watchers here are not beings you could point to. They are pauses, they are thresholds, they are the feeling that some ground asks you to slow down. And as you move on, that feeling stays gentle and grounding, like a hand resting lightly on the story without ever needing to guide it. You feel the story begin to lean toward a turning point, not abrupt, but deliberate. Kingship is approaching not as an invention, but as an accumulation. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptian pharaohs did not appear suddenly fully formed. Archaeology suggests a long process of consolidation during the late pre-dynastic period. One interpretation is that leadership slowly gathered symbolic weight until it hardened into divine authority. And what if the watchers did not vanish, but were gradually folded into human figures? You imagine respected leaders whose influence extends beyond a single season. They oversee irrigation. They settle disputes. They perform rituals on behalf of the community. The evidence we do have points to emerging elite burials that predate dynasties. Most historians agree that these individuals were not yet kings, but they were becoming something more than elders. A careful reading might suggest that people began to trust certain humans to embody order. And what if this trust replaced the need for unseen watchers? In later ideology, the pharaoh is described as the guarantor of Maat. What's broadly accepted is that this role was central to Egyptian kingship. One interpretation is that the king inherited responsibilities once attributed to the cosmos itself. Historians still argue whether kingship arose from religious belief or whether religion was shaped to support kingship. A more cautious explanation could be that belief and power grew together, entwined from the start. You notice how smoothly this transition occurs in story. There is no rebellion against watchers. There is no divine war. Authority simply changes hands. The evidence we do have points to continuity rather than rupture. And what if this was intentional, a way of making new power feel familiar rather than disruptive? Some texts describe God's withdrawing as humans take on greater responsibility. This theory isn't widely accepted as literal history. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reads like a lesson. What if the story is saying that once humans claimed the role of maintaining order unseen, guidance stepped back? You consider how comforting this would be. The world is not abandoned. It is entrusted. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptian religion emphasized duty over domination. A careful reading might suggest that kingship was framed as service to balance rather than personal rule. And what if watchers became unnecessary once someone stood visibly in that role? Archaeology shows early royal imagery, blending human and divine traits. Crowns echo symbols of land and sky. Names link rulers to cosmic forces. Historians still argue whether these symbols reflect belief or propaganda. A more cautious explanation could be that early kings needed to feel larger than life to replace older, unseen authorities. And what if myth smoothed that replacement? You pause on how this feels emotionally. Watching from afar is gentle. Being ruled by a human is intimate. What's broadly accepted is that centralized power brings both stability and anxiety. One interpretation is that imagining divine kings helped reduce that anxiety. And what if the memory of watchers softened the fear of being governed by someone like yourself? Some parts of this story are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in pinpointing the exact moment watchers faded, but in noticing how seamlessly responsibility shifted. As the first pharaohs step into view, they do not feel like replacements. They feel like continuations. The land remains. The river flows. Order is still the goal. Only now the watching has a face. You carry that image forward. The watchers have not disappeared. They have transformed into expectation ritual and role. And as kingship takes root, the story does not lose its quiet origin. It carries it inside like a memory of when order belonged to everyone and no one needed to claim it out loud. You move onward with the sense that nothing truly vanished, it only changed shape. Memory does that. It smooths edges, blends layers, and turns experience into belief. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptian religion evolved continuously rather than replacing itself in stages. Archaeology suggests strong lines of continuity between pre-dynastic practices and later formal worship. One interpretation is that earlier ideas were not discarded but absorbed into new frameworks. And what if the watchers survived not as figures but as habits of thought? You notice how later gods inherit roles that once felt abstract. Order becomes a deity. Balance gains a name. Watching becomes judgment, then ritual, then awe. The evidence we do have points to gradual elaboration rather than sudden invention. Most historians agree that religious systems tend to layer rather than reset. A careful reading might suggest that watchers were not forgotten, but translated into a language suited for temples and texts. In this process, memory turns into religion. What's broadly accepted is that myth helps societies remember what matters. One interpretation is that stories about earlier ages preserved values when direct experience no longer could. Historians still argue whether myth reflects lived reality or idealized memory. A more cautious explanation could be that it reflects both weaving experience and aspiration together. You imagine elders telling stories to children about a time when the world felt watched but not ruled. Over generations, details shift, names appear, relationships form. The evidence we do have points to oral tradition as creative rather than static. And what if each retelling gently adjusted the watchers to fit a changing world? There is a popular rumor that ancient Egyptians deliberately hid knowledge of earlier ages within religious symbolism. This theory isn't widely accepted and lacks supporting evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less about secrecy and more about storytelling. What if symbols were chosen not to conceal facts, but to carry meaning across time? You notice how later rituals emphasize repetition. Daily temple offerings, seasonal festivals. What's broadly accepted is that repetition stabilizes belief. One interpretation is that by repeating actions, people recreated the order they believed once existed naturally. And what if this repetition was an attempt to keep the feeling of being watched without returning to uncertainty? As belief formalizes, imagination narrows. Stories become authorized. Variations fade. Archaeology suggests that state religion standardizes myth. Historians still argue whether this process strengthened or weakened spiritual experience. A more cautious explanation could be that it did both. And what if watchers disappeared from official stories because they were too flexible to control? You pause on that thought. Flexibility can feel dangerous to power. What's broadly accepted is that centralized systems prefer clear hierarchies. One interpretation is that watchers represented a form of order that did not answer to anyone. And what if that independence made them unsuitable for a world increasingly defined by rule? Some parts of this story are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in uncovering a hidden religion beneath Egyptian belief, but in noticing how ideas adapt to survive. As the night grows quieter, the watchers feel less like entities and more like echoes. They are present in the way later gods are described. They linger in the emphasis on balance. They survive in the belief that the world notices human action. They no longer need names. You let that realization settle. Nothing essential was lost. It was reshaped. And as memory turns into ritual, and ritual into institution, the calm sense of being observed does not disappear. It simply moves inward, becoming part of how people understand themselves, their duties, and their place, within a world that still feels quietly attentive. You arrive at a stretch of the story where time itself feels debated. People begin to speak of lost ages, earlier worlds, and moments before memory. What's broadly accepted is that many cultures describe a distant era that felt simpler or more ordered than the present. Archaeology suggests no clear break separating such an age from documented history. One interpretation is that these stories arise when change accelerates and people look backward for stability. And what if the watchers belong to this imagined distance, not as rulers, but as anchors? You notice how often these lost ages are described without detail. There are no dates, no names, just atmosphere. The evidence we do have points to this vagueness as intentional. Most historians agree that mythic time is not measured like historical time. A careful reading might suggest that distance itself grants authority. And what if the Watchers feel powerful because they exist beyond counting? In Egypt, later texts speak of a time before conflict, before disorder entered the world. What's broadly accepted is that such descriptions serve moral rather than chronological purposes. Historians still argue whether these passages reflect memory of environmental stress or philosophical reflection on human behavior. A more cautious explanation could be that they express longing rather than loss. And what if Watchers symbolize the feeling that once things worked without effort? There is a popular rumor that a catastrophic event ended an earlier advanced age. This theory isn't widely accepted and lacks archaeological support. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a narrative tool. What if imagining catastrophe helps explain why the present feels harder than the past? You consider how change feels when you are inside it. Gradual shifts can feel sudden in memory. The evidence we do have points to long transitions in climate settlement and social structure along the Nile. Most historians agree that these changes unfolded over centuries. One interpretation is that people later compressed these shifts into stories of fall and departure. And what if Watchers withdrew, not because something ended, but because something slowly became unfamiliar? Lost age stories often frame humans as inheritors rather than creators. What's broadly accepted is that this framing reduces responsibility while increasing reverence. A careful reading might suggest that it comforts people to believe order existed before them. And what if Watchers allowed humans to see themselves as caretakers of something older rather than inventors of everything? You pause with that idea. Caretaking feels gentler than ruling. The evidence we do have points to Egyptian kingship emphasizing maintenance rather than conquest in its earliest forms. Historians still argue whether this emphasis reflects ideology or reality. A more cautious explanation could be that it reflects aspiration. And what if the memory of Watchers encouraged rulers to present themselves as preservers rather than masters? As stories of lost ages circulate, they also create boundaries, before and after, then and now. Archaeology suggests that such boundaries are rarely sharp in practice. One interpretation is that myth simplifies what history complicates. And what if Watchers mark the boundary between experience and explanation? Some parts of this story are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in proving a lost age existed, but in understanding why humans repeatedly imagine one. As the night deepens, the idea of a world watched over gently without command feels especially soothing, not because it was real, but because it suggests possibility. It suggests that order can exist without force. And what if that idea mattered most when force became unavoidable? You carry this sense of a lost age forward, not as history, but as mood. The Watchers here are not figures standing behind thrones. They are the quiet sense that the past once felt lighter. And as you move on, that lightness fades into the present, leaving behind a story that does not insist on belief, only reflection. You begin to feel how stories change once they are written down. Something fluid becomes fixed. Something shared becomes official. What's broadly accepted is that many Egyptian myths were recorded centuries or even millennia after the periods they describe. Archaeology suggests that writing preserved ideas but also narrowed them. One interpretation is that once watchers entered text, they could no longer shift freely with memory. And what if writing itself changed what it meant to be watched? You imagine a scribe working carefully, choosing words that will last longer than voices ever could. The evidence we do have points to writing as a tool of continuity and control. Most historians agree that literacy in ancient Egypt was limited to trained specialists. A careful reading might suggest that stories recorded in temples reflect institutional priorities as much as popular belief. And what if the watchers became quieter, not because they faded from thought, but because they did not fit neatly into official language? Earlier watching felt collective. Now it becomes documented, recorded. The shift matters. What's broadly accepted is that record-keeping transforms accountability. One interpretation is that when actions can be written down, observation no longer needs imagination. Historians still argue whether this shift reduced or intensified moral pressure. A more cautious explanation could be that it simply changed its shape. And what if watchers moved from story into archive? You notice how later, Egyptian texts emphasize order through lists, names, and classifications. Gods are grouped, roles are defined, relationships are stabilized. Archaeology suggests this mirrors administrative practice. One interpretation is that religious thought adapted to bureaucratic thinking. And what if beings that only watched without clear function slowly slipped out of focus? There is a popular rumor that scribes intentionally removed references to earlier belief systems. This theory isn't widely accepted and lacks direct evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about selection rather than suppression. What if scribes simply recorded what mattered most to their own moment? You consider how memory works when filtered through authority. Stories that align with power survive. Stories that resist it soften or disappear. What's broadly accepted is that state religion tends to favor clarity. A careful reading might suggest that watchers, as ambiguous figures, were difficult to standardize. And what if ambiguity itself was their weakness? In official texts, gods act, they speak, they judge. Watching alone is passive. The evidence we do have points to a preference for agency in written myth. Historians still argue whether this reflects belief or narrative style. A more cautious explanation could be that stories need motion to hold attention once removed from living ritual. And what if watchers belonged to a kind of belief that writing could not fully hold? You pause to notice how the tone changes. Earlier stories feel spacious. Written texts feel deliberate. Both have value. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in accusing writing of erasing watchers, but in noticing how media shapes memory. As you sit with this, the watchers feel present again, not in text, but between lines. In what is not said, in what no longer needs explanation. The land still watches, the sky still turns. And even as words fix stories in place, meaning continues to drift quietly beyond them. You move forward with that awareness. Writing did not end the age of watchers. It reframed it. Watching became implicit, assumed, no longer named. And in that silence, the watchers remain exactly where they have always been, in the space where attention rests when explanation runs out. You feel the story narrowing again, not in scope, but in focus. The watchers no longer appear as figures in myth or margins of text. They persist instead as a feeling that refuses to disappear. What's broadly accepted is that belief systems rarely vanish completely. Archaeology suggests that older ideas often survive inside newer ones, reshaped but recognizable. One interpretation is that watchers lingered as an undercurrent rather than a doctrine. And what if endurance mattered more than visibility? You notice how later Egyptian thought emphasizes conscience, not only law, but inner alignment. What's broadly accepted is that moral responsibility in Egypt was both social and personal. The evidence we do have points to an expectation that individuals internalize order. A careful reading might suggest that once watching moved inside it no longer needed a name. And what if the watchers became something like an inner witness? This shift is subtle. Earlier watching came from skyland or story. Now it comes from within. Historians still argue whether this internalization reflects genuine belief change or simply a new way of expressing the same idea. A more cautious explanation could be that as societies mature, they rely less on external reminders. And what if watchers completed their role by becoming unnecessary? You imagine standing alone, making a choice no one else will see. The evidence we do have points to moral systems depending on such moments. Most historians agree that societies cannot function on surveillance alone. One interpretation is that belief fills the gaps where enforcement cannot reach. And what if watchers were always meant to disappear into those gaps, leaving behind responsibility rather than fear? Later religious imagery still shows judgment, but it is often balanced by emphasis on intention. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptian judgment scenes weigh the heart, not the action alone. A careful reading might suggest that inner state matters as much as outward behavior. And what if this focus on the heart is the final transformation of watching no longer external at all? There is a popular rumor that ancient Egyptians feared constant divine surveillance. This theory isn't widely accepted in that form. Archaeology suggests instead a relationship built on balance and reciprocity. If we treat the rumor as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals modern assumptions more than ancient ones. What if watching was never about fear, but about belonging to a world that noticed? You pause on that word, noticed. To be noticed is different from being controlled. The evidence we do have points to early moral systems valuing harmony over punishment. Historians still argue whether later emphasis on judgment reflects moral anxiety or narrative emphasis. A more cautious explanation could be that stories dramatize what daily life already assumes. And what if watchers were always part of that assumption? As time passes, the watchers fade from language, but not from behavior. People continue to act as if balance matters, even when no one is present. What's broadly accepted is that cultural habits persist long after their original explanations fade. One interpretation is that watchers became encoded in custom. And what if tradition itself is a kind of watching? You think again about sacred places. Even when belief changes, people still lower their voices in certain spaces. Archaeology suggests that reverence can outlast theology. A careful reading might suggest that watchers survive wherever people instinctively slow down. And what if this instinct is older than story? Some parts of this story are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in tracking watchers through time like footprints, but in noticing how often humans behave as if something unseen still matters. As the night stretches on, the idea of watchers feels less like myth and more like posture, how you stand in the world, how carefully you move. The land does not correct you, the sky does not speak, but something in you remains attentive. You carry that attentiveness forward. It does not ask for belief. It does not demand explanation. It simply exists steady and quiet. And in that steadiness, the watchers reach their final form, not as rulers, not as beings, but as the habit of awareness itself, lingering long after the stories have gone silent. You begin to feel how the story loosens its grip on figures and names, returning instead to uncertainty. This is where the mist settles most gently. What's broadly accepted is that physical evidence for many early beliefs is limited, fragmented, and often indirect. Archaeology suggests that objects can tell us what people did, but rarely exactly what they thought. One interpretation is that gaps in evidence invite stories to step in. And what if watchers live most comfortably in those gaps where certainty fades? You imagine an archaeologist brushing dust from a shard of pottery. The shape is clear, the use is guessed, the meaning remains open. The evidence we do have points to skilled craftsmanship, careful repetition, and shared style. Most historians agree that interpretation begins where material ends. A careful reading might suggest that the watchers emerge not from what is found, but from what is missing. This boundary matters. Stone can show where people lived. Bones can show what they ate. Tools can show how they worked. But belief rarely leaves clean traces. Historians still argue whether belief should be inferred cautiously or boldly. A more cautious explanation could be that we should resist filling silence too quickly. And what if the watchers are reminders to slow interpretation down rather than rush it forward? There is a popular rumor that missing evidence proves deliberate erasure of earlier rulers. This theory isn't widely accepted and lacks archaeological support. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cautionary tale about how absence can be misread. What if silence does not hide secrets? What if it simply reflects the limits of preservation? You notice how often modern curiosity wants answers where ancient people may have been comfortable with questions. What's broadly accepted is that ancient worldviews allowed contradiction and ambiguity. One interpretation is that not everything needed resolution. And what if watchers represent a comfort with uncertainty rather than a challenge to it? As the discipline of archaeology developed, it learned to separate imagination from evidence. The evidence we do have points to careful methodology built on restraint. Most historians agree that responsible interpretation acknowledges limits. A careful reading might suggest that some mysteries are best left open. And what if the persistence of watchers reflects our reluctance to leave anything unanswered? You pause here appreciating the quiet discipline of not knowing. Some parts of this story are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in uncovering a hidden truth beneath the soil, but in understanding how humans respond when truth remains incomplete. You consider how easily speculation can harden into certainty if not handled gently. That is why language matters. Phrases like might, may, and suggests are not weaknesses. They are safeguards. Historians still argue whether certain myths preserve historical memory or symbolic meaning, and that argument itself is part of the story. You feel the pace slow further now. Questions replace claims. Space opens between ideas. The watchers here do not ask to be believed. They ask to be approached carefully. What if the real lesson of these stories is not about who ruled first, but about how to think responsibly about the past? As the imagined excavation ends for the day, tools are set aside. Notes are made. Nothing is rushed. The land remains patient. And in that patience, you sense something familiar. Watching does not always mean seeing clearly. Sometimes it means waiting. You carry that patience with you. It softens the edges of curiosity. It reminds you that mystery can coexist with knowledge without diminishing it. And as you move forward, the watchers feel less like a question to answer and more like a posture to adopt, attentive, careful, and content with what can and cannot be known. You sense the story preparing to rest, not by resolving itself, but by learning how to live with what remains unresolved. What's broadly accepted is that ancient cultures did not always seek final answers in the way modern thinking often does. Archaeology suggests that many belief systems were designed to hold questions rather than close them. One interpretation is that uncertainty itself had value. And what if the watchers were never meant to be explained, only acknowledged? You reflect on how much of this journey has been shaped by absence rather than presence. No clear names, no fixed dates, no physical remains. The evidence we do have points to continuity of human life rather than interruption. Most historians agree that Egypt's development shows gradual change rather than sudden replacement. A careful reading might suggest that stories of watchers fill emotional space rather than historical gaps. And what if that space matters, because it allows people to feel oriented within deep time? You imagine living without precise beginnings, no calendar counting from year one, no single origin point to return to. The evidence we do have points to early societies marking cycles instead of timelines. Floods returned, seasons repeated. Historians still argue whether linear history mattered much before writing. A more cautious explanation could be that repetition felt more trustworthy than origin stories. And what if watchers belonged to a worldview where beginnings were less important than balance? As kingship solidified, history became more linear. Dynasties followed dynasties. Names replaced moods. What's broadly accepted is that writing encourages sequence. One interpretation is that once rulers needed legitimacy, origins had to be clarified. And what if the watchers faded precisely because they did not fit neatly into lists and chronologies? You notice how this changes the listener's role. Earlier stories invite you to feel. Later, they invite you to remember. The evidence we do have points to myth giving way to record. Historians still argue whether something is lost in that transition. A more cautious explanation could be that something simply shifts. And what if the watchers remain available only to those willing to feel rather than catalogue? There is a popular rumor that hidden truths lie just beyond official history, waiting to be uncovered. This theory isn't widely accepted in that form. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mirror. What if the desire for watchers says more about modern discomfort with ambiguity than ancient belief? You pause on how calm this story has remained. No wars, no collapse, just movement. The evidence we do have points to storytelling as a stabilizing force. Most historians agree that myth often reassures rather than alarms. A careful reading might suggest that watchers were meant to steady listeners, not unsettle them. And what if their quiet endurance is the point? You feel the questions slowing now. They do not disappear. They soften. Some parts of this story are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in finding a final answer, but in noticing how comfortable it can feel to leave one open. As the imagined night grows deeper, the watchers no longer stand at the edge of thought. They recede into background awareness. You no longer look for them. You simply move with care, as if the world itself notices. That feeling is subtle, but it lingers. It does not demand belief. It does not ask for agreement. It simply invites attention. And as you drift closer to rest, you realize that perhaps the watchers were never rulers of land or sky, but companions to awareness itself, present wherever humans pause long enough to listen. You arrive at the end without crossing a finish line. The story does not stop so much as it settles. What's broadly accepted is that Egypt's earliest beliefs did not vanish when the first pharaoh appeared. Archaeology suggests continuity layering and careful inheritance, rather than replacement. One interpretation is that whatever people once called watchers did not disappear, but dissolved into everyday understanding. And what if that was always the intended ending? You look back across everything you have carried: land before crowns, order before law, watching before ruling. The evidence we do have points to human societies learning slowly how to hold responsibility. Historians still argue whether stories of watchers reflect memory metaphor or moral teaching. A more cautious explanation could be that they reflect all three at once, braided together so tightly that separating them would miss the point. By the time the first pharaoh ruled, watching had become embodied. The king watched the land. Officials watched the people. The people watched themselves. What's broadly accepted is that Egyptian civilization placed extraordinary emphasis on continuity. One interpretation is that kingship did not replace earlier order, but made it visible. And what if visibility was the true shift, not power? You notice how calm that makes the beginning feel in hindsight. Nothing was taken away. Something was simply named. The watchers did not fall. They stepped aside. Or perhaps they were never figures at all. The evidence we do have points to imagination working alongside survival. And imagination rarely announces when it changes form. There is a popular rumor that a final secret remains hidden beneath Egyptian history. This theory isn't widely accepted and often promises more than it can deliver. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes something gentler. What if the real secret is that there was never meant to be one? You let that idea rest. Some parts of this story are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. The mystery isn't in uncovering who ruled before Egypt, but in noticing how humans explain order before authority. Now the pacing slows further. Sentences stretch. The land quiets. The river continues its patient movement, unconcerned with names or titles. You feel how much of this journey has been about attention rather than answers. Watching rather than proving. You breathe more slowly. The idea of watchers no longer feels external. It feels like posture, like care, like the instinct to act as though the world matters, even when no one is looking. The ancient night deepens. Stars turn without instruction. The land holds memory without voice. Nothing demands belief. Nothing asks to be solved. You are allowed to rest here, holding only what feels steady. If the Watchers ever ruled, it may have been only in this sense. They ruled attention. They ruled patience. They ruled the space where certainty softens into understanding. You do not need to follow them any further. They do not lead, they remain. The story loosens its grip completely now. Thought slows, images fade, what remains is calm. Sweet dreams.